The sanctions were supposed to work. In 2019, the United States tightened restrictions around one of the least discussed but most important technologies in semiconductor manufacturing: photomasks. Most people have never heard of them. Even many technology enthusiasts focus on processors, lithography machines, or advanced memory chips. Photomasks rarely enter the conversation. Yet without them, none of those technologies exist. A modern semiconductor fabrication plant can spend billions of dollars on equipment, but if it cannot obtain the right photomasks, production simply stops. That was the logic behind many technology restrictions. Limit access to critical manufacturing tools, slow China's semiconductor industry, increase the cost of catching up. On paper, it looked reasonable. In practice, something else happened. By 2024, several Chinese companies were reporting major progress in domestically produced high-end photomasks. Not complete independence, not total technological parity, but enough progress to fundamentally change the conversation, and that matters far beyond the semiconductor sector. Because once a country learns how to replace one strategic bottleneck, it often discovers how to replace several others. The story begins with a simple question. What exactly is a photomask? Imagine trying to print a city map onto a grain of rice. Not a rough sketch, an exact blueprint containing billions of tiny features that must be positioned with extraordinary precision. That is essentially what semiconductor manufacturing does. Photomasks act like master templates. During lithography, patterns are projected onto silicon wafers, layer after layer, eventually creating the microscopic circuits inside modern chips. A single advanced processor may require dozens of masks. Some of the most sophisticated designs require hundreds. A tiny defect can ruin an entire production run worth millions of dollars. Which means photomasks are not just pieces of glass, they are precision-engineered manufacturing assets that sit near the very center of chip production. This is where the strategic importance becomes clear. When policymakers discuss semiconductor competition, public attention usually focuses on companies such as ASML, TSMC, or NVIDIA. Those companies deserve the attention they receive. But industrial systems often depend on smaller, less visible links. Photomasks are one of those links. In 2019, export controls and broader technology restrictions increased pressure on China's access to advanced semiconductor capabilities. The goal was not necessarily to halt progress forever. Even supporters of the restrictions rarely argued that. The objective was time, delay, make advancement slower, more expensive, and more difficult. There was a strong argument behind that strategy. Producing advanced photomasks requires specialized materials, precision manufacturing equipment, metrology systems, defect inspection technologies, and years of accumulated expertise. This is not something a company decides to build over a weekend. Industrial knowledge tends to compound. Once a country falls behind in a highly specialized field, catching up can take decades. For a while, many observers assumed photomasks would remain one of China's hardest obstacles. And honestly, that assumption was not unreasonable. Japanese firms had dominated important parts of the industry for years. Established suppliers possessed deep technical experience and customer trust. Semiconductor manufacturers are notoriously cautious. Nobody wants to experiment with a critical production component if failure could destroy yields. Yet pressure creates incentives. A lot of incentives. The more difficult foreign access became, the more attractive domestic alternatives appeared. Governments increased funding. Research institutes expanded programs. Private companies suddenly found customers willing to support long-term development efforts. One of the strange realities of industrial policy is that restrictions sometimes create exactly the market conditions domestic producers need. Washington tried to slow a technology ecosystem. Beijing responded by making parts of that ecosystem strategically unavoidable. That's not a judgment. It's simply what happened. But before concluding that China solved the photomask challenge completely, we need to examine what actually changed between 2019 and 2024. Because the answer is more complicated than either side likes to admit. And one company in particular became a surprisingly important piece of that story. One company kept appearing in industry reports during those years. Not because it suddenly overtook global leaders, not because it produced a miracle breakthrough, but because it represented something much more important. Proof that domestic substitution was moving from theory into production. Companies such as China's Shenzhen Qingyi Photomask, along with several emerging suppliers supported by national and provincial semiconductor initiatives, became symbols of a broader shift. Their role wasn't to dominate the world's most advanced chip manufacturing overnight. Their role was to close gaps that many analysts believed would remain open for much longer. That's a very different objective, and in some ways, a more realistic one. The semiconductor industry often gets described as a race. That metaphor can be misleading. Races have finish lines. Semiconductor ecosystems do not. A better comparison is a supply network. Thousands of companies, tens of thousands of specialized components, decades of accumulated expertise. The challenge isn't simply reaching the front. It's ensuring that no critical piece can be removed without disrupting the entire system. China's photomask effort started to make more sense when viewed through that lens. The goal wasn't immediate leadership. The goal was resilience. Consider what happened after 2019. Chinese semiconductor firms faced increasing uncertainty regarding access to advanced technologies. Some restrictions targeted specific companies. Others targeted equipment. Others focused on software and manufacturing capabilities. The cumulative effect was psychological as much as technical. Businesses dislike uncertainty. If a critical component might become unavailable tomorrow, companies start searching for alternatives today. That created demand. Demand created investment. Investment attracted talent. Talent improved products. And slowly, the cycle reinforced itself. One often overlooked factor was the sheer scale of China's domestic electronics market. Smartphones, industrial equipment, electric vehicles, telecommunications infrastructure, consumer electronics. Not every application requires cutting-edge 3-nanometer chips. Many products operate perfectly well on mature process nodes. That distinction matters a lot. Public discussion tends to focus on the most advanced chips because they're exciting. They're technological Formula One cars. The global economy, however, runs on delivery trucks. Microcontrollers, power management chips, sensors, industrial processors, automotive semiconductors. Many rely on manufacturing technologies that are less glamorous but enormously important. Domestic photomask suppliers didn't need to conquer the entire technological frontier immediately. They only needed to become good enough for a large portion of domestic demand. And that's where momentum began building. The result was a gradual reduction in dependence across certain market segments. Not total replacement, not complete independence. Reduction. Those words sound less dramatic, but they're often more accurate. This is where I think many conversations about sanctions become overly simplistic. Supporters sometimes assume restrictions automatically produce long-term technological advantages. Critics sometimes assume restrictions automatically fail. Reality sits somewhere between those positions. Restrictions absolutely impose costs. They delay projects. They increase expenses. They force redesigns. Some programs never recover. But they can also change incentives in unexpected ways. When access becomes uncertain, domestic capacity suddenly becomes valuable in ways it wasn't before. There's a reason economists spend so much time discussing substitution effects. People adapt. Companies adapt. Countries adapt. Sometimes faster than expected. A small example illustrates the point. During various phases of semiconductor restrictions, Chinese firms accelerated investments not only in photomasks, but also in materials, inspection systems, specialty chemicals, wafer manufacturing, packaging technologies, and industrial software. Each category had its own challenges. Each category had its own weaknesses. Yet together they formed something larger, an ecosystem. That's the part many headlines missed. The real story wasn't one technology. It was the interaction between dozens of technologies. A photomask company improving its capabilities helps foundries. Foundries create demand for materials suppliers. Materials suppliers support equipment manufacturers. Equipment manufacturers create opportunities for software developers. The process becomes self-reinforcing. Industrial development often looks slow until suddenly it doesn't. Then people start asking when the shift happened. The answer is usually years earlier. There is also a counter-argument worth taking seriously. Many of China's domestic photomask achievements still focus on mature and mid-range manufacturing segments. The highest-end semiconductor processes remain extraordinarily difficult. Global leaders still possess advantages in precision, reliability, defect control, and accumulated manufacturing experience. That matters. Anyone claiming the technological gap has disappeared entirely is moving faster than the evidence. Yet something interesting was becoming visible by 2024. The conversation itself was changing. 5 years earlier, many analysts debated whether domestic replacement was possible. By 2024, the debate increasingly focused on how much replacement had already occurred. Those are very different questions, and they lead directly to an even bigger issue. Because the most important consequence of China's photomask progress may have nothing to do with photomasks at all. It may be what the experience taught China's broader technology sector about surviving pressure. There's a phrase that appears repeatedly in discussions about industrial development: learning by doing. It sounds harmless, almost academic. What it actually means is that countries become capable by solving difficult problems repeatedly, not by reading about how others solved them. That may be the most important lesson hidden inside China's photomask story. Because the real asset created between 2019 and 2024 wasn't merely a collection of domestic photomasks. It was experience. Engineers learned where production defects emerge. Manufacturers learned how customers evaluate quality. Inspection teams learned which microscopic flaws matter and which don't. Supply chains learned how to coordinate under pressure. Those forms of knowledge are difficult to sanction because they exist inside organizations and people. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Remember the assumption from the beginning? The idea that restricting access to critical technologies would automatically preserve technological distance. That assumption contained a weakness. It treated technology as a product. In reality, technology is often a process. Products can be blocked. Processes can be learned, sometimes painfully, sometimes expensively, but learned nonetheless. Think about the history of industrial development. Japan followed that path after World War II. South Korea followed it decades later. Taiwan followed it in semiconductors. None of them became competitive because they purchased a few advanced products. They became competitive because they built organizations capable of producing those products repeatedly. China's semiconductor sector appears to be attempting the same transition. Whether it fully succeeds remains uncertain, but the direction is increasingly visible. Here's the reversal that many observers missed. The photomask story is often framed as evidence that sanctions failed. I don't think that's entirely correct. The restrictions achieved several objectives. They increased costs. They delayed progress. They complicated technology transfers. They forced Chinese companies to spend years and billions of dollars developing alternatives. Those are real effects. Yet, at the same time, the restrictions may have accelerated efforts that otherwise would have unfolded more slowly. Both statements can be true simultaneously. That's what makes technology competition so difficult. Success for one side doesn't automatically mean failure for the other. A government can achieve short-term objectives while unintentionally encouraging long-term adaptation. History is full of examples. Sometimes pressure weakens industries. Sometimes pressure forces them to mature. The outcome depends on the underlying capabilities already present. China entered this period with a massive engineering workforce, extensive manufacturing infrastructure, and substantial state support for strategic industries. That doesn't guarantee success, but it does change the probability calculations. There is another dimension people rarely discuss: ordinary consumers. Eventually, every supply chain battle lands somewhere practical. Phone prices, vehicle availability, industrial equipment costs, network infrastructure, consumer electronics. If domestic suppliers become more capable, competition increases. If competition increases, pricing power changes. And when pricing power changes, consumers usually notice. Not immediately, but eventually. The semiconductor industry can feel distant from daily life. In reality, it sits inside nearly every modern product people touch. That's why these developments matter beyond boardrooms and government offices. A more resilient semiconductor supply chain affects the cost and availability of technologies that millions of people depend upon. Where does this go next? My prediction is relatively straightforward. Over the next decade, China will continue reducing dependence across many mid-tier semiconductor technologies faster than many Western forecasts currently assume. The highest-end frontier remains another matter entirely. Advanced lithography, cutting-edge process nodes, and certain precision manufacturing segments still present formidable challenges. I wouldn't underestimate those obstacles. At the same time, I wouldn't assume they remain permanent. Industrial capabilities have a habit of looking impossible right before they become normal. The bigger question isn't whether China can domesticate one more technology. It's whether enough individual breakthroughs accumulate into something larger than the sum of their parts. And if the last 5 years are any indication, that accumulation process is already underway. Which brings us back to photomasks, an obscure manufacturing tool, a niche industry most people never think about. Yet one small bottleneck ended up revealing something much larger about how nations respond when critical technologies become inaccessible. The sanctions were supposed to slow progress. They did. The adaptation was supposed to take much longer. It didn't. And in technology competition, those two facts may end up defining the next decade more than either side expected. There's another reason the Photomask story deserves attention. It reveals how technology competition is changing. For decades, the dominant assumption in many advanced economies was that leadership in critical industries would remain relatively stable. The logic seemed obvious. If one country possessed the best equipment, the best suppliers, the deepest expertise, and the strongest ecosystem, maintaining that lead should be easier than building it from scratch. Most of the time, that assumption is correct. What is often overlooked is the effect of prolonged strategic pressure. Pressure changes incentives, and incentives shape behavior. When semiconductor technologies became a matter of national security rather than ordinary commerce, governments started treating industrial capacity differently. Research budgets expanded, talent programs grew. Strategic sectors received political attention that would have been difficult to imagine 20 years ago. The photomask industry became one small battlefield inside a much larger contest. Not because photomasks are glamorous, because they are essential. There is a lesson here for every country watching this competition unfold. Industrial strength isn't measured only by what a nation can invent. It's also measured by what a nation can replace when access disappears. Those are related skills, but they aren't identical. Some countries excel at innovation and struggle with manufacturing scale. Others excel at production, but depend on foreign intellectual property. The strongest ecosystems usually possess both. China's broader objective appears increasingly clear: reduce vulnerabilities. Not eliminate all foreign dependence overnight. Reduce enough of it that external pressure becomes less effective over time. That goal is easier to state than achieve. Yet the trend line matters. Look across multiple sectors: electric vehicles, battery manufacturing, solar equipment, industrial robotics. Telecommunications infrastructure. Certain semiconductor supply chain segments. The pattern repeats often enough that it deserves attention. A dependency is identified. Investment follows. Domestic competitors emerge. Capabilities improve. The cycle repeats. Not every effort succeeds. Some fail entirely. Others take far longer than planners expect. But enough projects have advanced that foreign observers can no longer dismiss the process as theoretical. That shift in perception may be one of the biggest developments of the past decade. 5 years ago, many discussions centered on China's technological ambitions. Today, more discussions focus on China's technological execution. Ambition is cheap. Execution is expensive. Execution requires factories, engineers, suppliers, logistics networks, financing mechanisms, quality control systems, and years of persistence. Those things are harder to build than headlines. I do have one concern, a significant one. Many governments around the world are increasingly pursuing industrial self-sufficiency at the same time. The political logic is understandable. The economic consequences are more complicated. Global semiconductor supply chains became efficient because countries specialized. The Netherlands developed lithography leadership. Japan dominated key materials. Taiwan mastered foundry manufacturing. South Korea excelled in memory. The United States led in design and software. Each participant benefited from the network. If every country attempts to duplicate every capability, costs rise. Innovation can slow. Consumers ultimately pay part of the bill. That's a risk worth remembering. Technology resilience and economic efficiency are not always the same objective. Sometimes policymakers must choose between them. My own view is that we're entering a period where resilience will be valued more highly than efficiency. Not because it's economically optimal, because governments increasingly see technological dependence as a strategic vulnerability. The Photomask story fits neatly into that larger trend. A tiny component inside a massive industrial system became strategically important because decision-makers realized that even small bottlenecks can create enormous leverage. And once a bottleneck is identified, someone eventually tries to remove it. That is exactly what happened between 2019 and 2024. The final verdict? China did not suddenly leap ahead of every global leader in photomask technology. Anyone claiming that is overstating the evidence. But China did something arguably more important. It demonstrated that a technology once viewed primarily as a vulnerability could become a growing domestic capability within a relatively short period of time. That doesn't end the semiconductor competition. If anything, it signals that the competition is entering a new phase, one where success is measured less by who owns a single technology and more by who can build complete ecosystems that survive disruption. My prediction is simple. 10 years from now, analysts will spend less time debating whether China can replace individual technologies, and more time debating how many replacement efforts are already far enough along to matter. And when they look back at the timeline, the photomask industry will probably appear as one of those quiet milestones that seemed minor at the time, the kind of development that barely made headlines, then slowly became impossible to ignore. If you enjoyed this analysis, share your thoughts below. I'd be interested to know which semiconductor bottleneck you think becomes the next major battleground. Because history suggests there is always another one waiting in line.